And the next speaker, Einar Bratteng, he's a PhD candidate from the University in Oslo. He's going to give us an insight into designing regulatory systems for end of waste. So there we are.
Thank you. I'm a Google scholar, a legal scholar from University of Oslo. I'm also associated with the EarthresQue project here at Ås. My perspective is a legal perspective, and I'm trying to kind of walk you through my PhD thesis. And what I'm trying to do, the core concept, is to design a better system for transforming waste to product. That's what I'm trying to do. My background, I'm a lawyer, I'm a PhD candidate. I've written a book about waste law. My ambition was also to write a book about international and European chemical legislation, but simultaneously with writing a PhD, but that was harder than I thought, so that project is on ice. And my approach is pretty simple. If you look at like the body of law regulating resource efficiency and circular economy on a European level, it's huge. It's vast and it's growing. And when I looked at the report from the European Court of Auditors, they measured the circular economy progress from the first European Action Plan to the second. And the progress is 0.4%. It's almost nothing. So even though we have like this huge body of European law, the progress for circular economy on the European level is nothing. So my approach was pretty simple, right? There's a huge body. Maybe the problem is not it's not like there's lacking legislation, but how it's not implemented in an effective way. That's kind of my basic premise. Like, it could be that the problem is not lack of regulation, but it's not effectively implemented in national law. So that's my approach, my like plain simple approach, and I'm hoping like to keep this lecture simple. So my research question is, how can the end of waste criteria be operationalized to contribute to more circular economy? And one of like the really important tools to transform waste to products on an international or European level is the end of waste criteria, which are in the Waste Framework Directive, Article 6. So that's the article I'm writing about. And that's the tool I'm trying to base and design a better system for end of waste on, right? So my legal perspective, when I'm trying to answer this research question, I have to look at the different barriers of law, right? We have the first level, which is the international level of law. We have the second, it's the European law. And we have like the third level, which is the national level of law. And if I want to design a national system for end of waste, it has to be coherent with all those three levels. Because we are bound by international law. In some instances, we are bound by European law, and then we have like the national perspective. So if I want to design a better system, I have to be coherent with all those levels, those three levels of law. Okay? So the structure of this, of my thesis and this lecture, is pretty straightforward. How does the end of waste criteria function? And then I have to answer, what is circular economy from a European perspective? Right? What is circular economy from a European perspective? And the reason I have to do that, right, is because from a philosophical question, every law has to have a purpose. Because if the law has no purpose, it doesn't solve a problem. So if I'm designing a system, it has to have a purpose. And the next couple of chapters are quite like straightforward. What are the international barriers? What are the European barriers? And what national barriers exist on a national level? And then chapter 7, how does we do this more effectively? And to get straight to the point, how does the EUA criteria contribute to a more circular economy? That's a long story, but if we take the main point there and just dumb it down, what I'm trying to illustrate, and I apologize for the graph, I made it myself. If we look at the red line, what I'm trying to say here is there's a certain administrative cost for each ton of waste, right? And there's a certain administrative cost for each ton of products. As long as the black line, the product line, is below the red line, there's an incentive for the waste holder to transform the waste to product or a secondary raw material. But if the costs of products are below or above the red line, there's no incentive for the waste holder to transform the waste to secondary raw material. And the meta norm, or the meta trend at the European level, is to raise quality requirements for products. So if you look at the vast body of law, we can see that what's happening is there's a larger amount of product requirements compared to waste requirements, because the waste law has been developed since 1975. So what's happening, at least at a short or medium long term, is as a meta trend that the costs of products are rising, which in a short medium terms, probably would give the effect that the economics incentives for transforming waste to products are lacking. And the reason that's why that's happening, because it's the end of waste phase, the quality benchmark for when waste cease to be waste is the product regulations. So the higher the product regulations are, the less incentive the waste holder has to transform it. So that's kind of a bottom line. Okay. And this chapter, What is a Circular Economy, is a chapter I have spent like several hundred hours on, and it gotten me basically nowhere. Because the circular economy is defined in the taxonomy regulation, and the core of the concept is quite straightforward. Like materials, we want to prolong the lifespan of materials at any stage. But if I answer that question, if you try to break that definition down and ask the question, which environmental objectives are the definition of circular economy actually promoting in an EU's perspective, the picture gets unclear. Because the wording of the definition is open, and it's meant to be open. So you can probably put any environmental objective within the grasp of that definition. And that makes it probably difficult to use the definition as a normative benchmark for alternative system. So what I have done, when we break it down, high level of protection for health and environment, high quality recycling, create trust in markets for secondary raw materials, is probably purposes I can use for designing an alternative systems for end of waste. So this is my normative benchmark for making a more effective system. And then we have the international barriers. We have international legal obligations, like we have the Stockholm Convention, we have Basel Convention, we have the Minamata Convention, we have different sets of conventions regulating chemicals, which impacts to which extent waste can cease to be waste on several levels, but that's quite straightforward. We have the economic barrier, which I've already have touched, and we have political barriers. And the reason, and that barrier springs out of the fact that the definition of circular economy is very wide. So for example, climate policies, depending how you enact a climate policies, can be contrary to the goal of prolonging materials. And that reduces the likelihood that circular economy will be prioritized at the political level. So there's more, when we're talking about end of waste, there are more barriers than the legal barriers that kind of affects to which extent waste actually is transformed to products or secondary raw material. And the European barriers are quite straightforward. In EU waste law, in our relationship to Article 6 in the Waste Framework Directive, there is a demand that national legislation has to give an opportunity for the waste holder to obtain a clarification whether the waste is waste or not. And there are also some different additional demands, but that's not so important. And the problem in Norway that these kinds of mechanisms doesn't exist. If you are a waste holder and you want a clarification on whether that object or substance is waste or not, there is no possibility for you to get a clarification of that issue. The Norwegian model is a self-assessment model. And I think it's only Norway, Luxembourg, and Sweden that has that kind of self-assessment model. And when we look at the national barriers, I really can't use a legal dogmatic method. I can't analyze the law and then do a comparative evaluation whether national law is consistent with European law, because just the body of law at European levels is huge. It's enormous. So what I did was I did a survey, 2 surveys, one at the Norwegian National Environmental Agency, and then an industry survey. And then I kind of asked this straightforward: what are the biggest barriers? What are the biggest barriers for end of waste in Norway, from an administrative perspective and from an industrial perspective? And what my hypothesis was that I would, when I asked those questions, I would kind of get the answer that there were several advanced barriers to the end of waste, but there really isn't. From an industry perspective, it was pretty clear that the industry lacks confidence with the administration. Many of in the survey, it was clear that the industry didn't have any faith in that the public authorities would be competent to give a decision whether a substance or object was waste or not. There was also a big issue in the industry, but there was no lack of mechanisms to clarify legal status. So when they had a waste, they were not sure whether they can use it as a secondary raw material or not. So when we look at the barriers, in the academic literature, there's identified several advanced it's a pretty developed academic literature. But if we ask the industry what the problem is, the problem at the point we are in this phase is pretty straightforward, and they're pretty simple. So if we sum up, if we look at the surveys and compare them, there's like 5 huge, at this point, 5 huge problems with the current national system. And I'm not sure from a legal perspective we can call it a legal system, but that's another story. There's basically a lack of mechanism for information and experience exchange between public authorities and the industry. There's no communication between the public authorities and the industry about the needs of the industry. There's no administrative learning, because the Norwegian model is a self-assessment model. So the public authorities are not gaining any knowledge at all about the end of waste phase or what the needs are. And there's also a lack of public access and lack of resources on authorities. It was pretty clear by the surveys that there were no plans in the near future to allocate more resources to end the waste problems. So that brings me over to the conclusion. What I'm suggesting is that the waste holders is given a right, but not the obligation to request clarification. And a big question is who is going to make that clarification? It's not obvious that it is the public authorities, right? Because the industry lack confidence in their competence. But to mitigate the problem with a lack of administrative learning, my suggestion is that the decision of whether a waste is waste or not is given to the national authorities, and in combination with the national environmental agency and the public control authorities. And then I also have some other suggestions, but I guess my time is up. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Einar. This was complicated. I understand why a PhD is a high-hanging fruit. A lot of work, and you might not find what you wanted to find. One question, if I understood you correctly, you imply that a circular economy is not compatible with the Paris Agreement in the sense that it doesn't sort of help climate mitigation. Is that correct? Yeah, but not just like to say that circular economy as general wouldn't comply or wouldn't be coherent with the Paris Agreement is probably not correct. But there are elements. Thank heavens.
Yeah, but there's elements depending on how you deploy climate policies that are on edge with circular economy. And in I think it was like the last report from the UN climate change panel. They said that circular economy in general was not a measure that could be viewed as climate mitigation.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll take that back to the office and
yeah.
have a look. And just one final point. You said something about an ambition writing a book on chemicals.
Yeah.
That is very important. Please do so. I read in the paper today that in order for the Norwegian government to clean up what is called Randsfjorden for the waste, chemical waste produced by PFAS, you need more than 1 billion crowns, also 1 milliard kroner. And this is just the starting point. There are so many of these chemical components around us and in us. It's just incredible. So please continue your book and your good work.
Thank you.
Okay.